Thank you. Well, everyone, super excited to be here. Thanks for putting the paper on the program. Paper's called Who Values Democracy? Let's jump right in. All right, so over the last 200 years, about half of all countries on Earth have transitioned from autocracy to democracy. And we know that when these democratizations are successful, they're defined by profound changes to political institutions, like the introduction of free and fair elections, expanded voting rights to people that used to not have them, and increased protections around things like freedom of expression. We've also got, we've got tons of examples of these throughout history. So all of the transitions from, say, like monarchy to parliamentary democracy throughout Europe, fall of fascism in Germany, Italy, and Spain, replacement of military dictatorships throughout Latin America in the 1970s and 1980s. Now, we also know, in addition to changing political institutions, these democratizations change things like policy, the distribution of resources in these countries, and various macroeconomic aggregates that we care about. But despite the historical importance of these transitions, we understand very little about how financial markets react to them. So in this paper, I'm going to try to understand, one, what can we learn about asset pricing from studying democratizations? And then on the flip side, what can asset prices teach us about the democratization process? Now, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, the paper's got two main results. I'm just going to tell them to you right now. So the first result is that markets don't seem to like democratizations very much. I'm going to find that prices fall substantially, and I'm going to argue it's because measures of risk premia rise substantially during democratizations. Now, the second result's about what's driving this large negative stock market reaction. In particular, I'm going to argue that it's coming from a rise in the fear over future redistribution, or a rise in redistribution risk. Now, what do I mean by democratization, risk premia, redistribution? That's what I hope to make clear over the rest of the talk. But I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with exactly where I'm going with things today. All right, so what do I mean by a rise in risk premia? So here I'm showing you the level of the log dividend yield benchmarked to its value 3 years prior to the start of a democratization. So democratization is beginning in time t. And democratizations last an average of about 8.5 years long in my sample, so the democratization is going on all along over here. So we can see dividend yields rise sharply going into democratizations, ultimately peaking in the year of the democratization start, and then remaining elevated for about 5 years after the democratization begins. Actually remains elevated about 7 or 8 years after the democratization begins. We also see financial markets seem to predict democratizations to some extent as the dividend yield begins to rise a year prior to the beginning of the democratization. Now, in principle, rise in dividend yields tells us one of two things. It tells us that this is either discount rates are going up or expected cash flows are falling. Now, a little bit later on, I'm going to show you that aggregate expected cash flow growth doesn't seem to be affected by this, and so by democratizations. And so I'm going to argue that this is mostly driven by a rise in discount rates, in particular a rise in risk premia. That said, there is going to end up being sort of a sneaky cash flow channel that comes in here. I'm going to have a kind of a model that talks about this a little bit later. So it's going to end up being both cash flow effects and discount rate effects, but I'll go into exactly what I mean by that a little bit later. Now, just to give you guys kind of like a rough idea of the magnitudes here I'm showing you the exact same series, but for financial crises. So, it's pretty clear. These are economically large increases in risk premia, similar in magnitude to what we see during financial crises. Now, of course, there's just a lot of different things that happen during democratizations, right? So democratizations could be brought about by something that causes dividend yields to rise. Also, democratizations bring about certain kinds of uncertainty and other sorts of things that might affect dividend yields and have nothing to do with redistribution. So the first part of the paper is going to be about trying to understand whether this is something that's about democracy or just the stuff that's going on alongside these sort of democratizations. Now, in order to get at this, I'm going to have two different approaches. The first approach is going to be kind of like a death by 1,000 cuts approach. So I'm going to argue that a few channels that we might think are central don't seem to be driving the results. In particular, I'm going to show you that the results don't seem to be driven by a rise in macroeconomic risk. So kind of different measures of macroeconomic risk are pretty similar both inside and outside democratizations. I'm also going to argue that we can't explain this with either a rise in generic political risk or transition risk. So I'm going to find that other periods where political risk is presumably high and other sorts of transition episodes are not going to see the same effect that I just showed you on dividend yields that we see during democratizations. Now next, understanding that I can't rule out sort of all channels that are going on here, I'm going to use some sort of quasi-experimental variation coming from a change in Catholic Church doctrine in favor of democracy from 1959 to 1963. Now, what this change in Catholic Church doctrine did is it made majority Catholic autocracies substantially more likely to democratize than the other countries in my sample. I'm going to find consistent with this that average excess returns are substantially elevated in the majority Catholic autocracies relative to non-Catholic autocracies in a difference in differences framework. So after pinning down that democratization seems to drive an increase in risk premia, the rest of the paper is going to be about trying to understand the mechanism that's driving this result. And like I told you, I'm going to come down that this is driven by a rise in redistribution risk. And this is going to follow along a large political economy literature that argues that redistribution risk is sort of the central driving force within sort of democratic transitions, the sort of central friction that's preventing these democratic transitions. Now, I'm going to do this in two different ways. I'm going to do this both empirically and theoretically. So in the data, I'm going to show you that substantial redistribution indeed follows successful democratizations, but not failed ones. In particular, I'm going to find that successful democratizations compared to failed democratizations are going to come with a 25% rise in the size of the public sector, so a rise in tax revenue GDP ratios, a 2.3 percentage point decline in the Gini coefficient, and a 6.7 percentage point rise on average in the labor share of income. I'm also going to find that sort of other channels of redistribution seem to be at play as well. I'm going to find that corruption and bribery indices fall substantially after successful democratizations, as do some indicators of sort of economic competition rise. I'm going to find more sort of creation of new firms, and I'm going to find that pro-competitive regulation indices rise. Now, is this a lot of redistribution? Is this a little redistribution? It's very difficult to understand that without a model. So the last part of the paper is going to take a sort of canonical model of democratic transitions and embed within it a sort of asset pricing model. And it's going to have, the way the model kind of works is there's going to be two different groups. There's going to be a group of wealthy elites who own all of the stuff, and there's going to be a group of poorer citizens. Democratizations are going to come with an increased likelihood that society is going to transition to democracy, but there's also some probability that it fails. If we transition to democracy, we're going to get all of the redistribution that I just talked about here. And I find that when I take this model and I calibrate it to the redistribution that we actually see in the data, I'm going to be able to match the rise in dividend yields that I showed you on the previous slide entirely just with the redistribution that we actually see in the data. So this is going to provide pretty strong support for this sort of canonical workhorse model within political economy. I'm also going to find that if I take the same model and run it backwards, so now going from democracy to autocracy, that I can explain the negligible asset pricing effect that we see in autocratizations as well. So the same redistribution-based framework is going to be able to explain asset price movements going in both directions. All right, so now that we understand where we're going, let's jump right in. All right, so this was really a pretty large data project. It took a lot of time to put all the different sources together. In the interest of time today, I'm going to go through the data pretty quickly so we can kind of get into the results. All right, so equity data are going to come from four major sources. The main one's going to be global financial data. I'm going to combine this with data from Jordy, Sherlock, and Taylor Macro History Database, IBES Global, and FactSet. All told, this is going to give me an unbalanced panel of 90 countries that spans more than 200 years. It's a pretty well filled in panel. I have an average of about 65 years per country, at least for the dividend yields data. Data on political institutions are going to come from the Varieties of Democracy database. These guys basically survey over 3,500 country-specific experts to put together over 1,000 different series that denote different kinds of political institutions in countries over the last 200 years. I'm going to have tons of different sort of events data that I'm going to use as controls. I'll go into that in a second when we actually get there in the results. And I'm going to collect data on a number of different sources of sort of redistribution, and that I'm going to look at a little bit later when we go into the democracy and redistribution results. All right, so if I want to study democratizations, I need to know when they actually occur. So to get at this today, I'm going to use data from this Episodes of Regime Transformation dataset, or ERT, which I'm going to combine with this Limburg et al. Working paper here. These are the democratization and autocratization episodes that this VDEM dataset puts together. All told, this is going to give me 64 different democratization episodes that last an average of 8.5 years long each, at least for the ones for which I have asset pricing data. In the paper, I do this with 6 other measures of democratizations. The results are not just qualitatively the same, but like actually quantitatively the same. I'm not going to show you the horrible table, robustness table that I have that shows all of this, but if you guys want to see it, I'll show it to you a little bit later. Now, the reason I like the ERT data as opposed to some of these other sources is that they're the only data source that was going to provide me full coverage of these democratization episodes. So they're going to tell me when these democratizations start. They're going to tell me when they end. They're They're also going to tell me whether these democratizations succeed and come with a permanent transition to democracy, or they fail and revert back to autocracy. And this is going to be important later on. I'm going to compare the outcomes of successful and failed democratizations when I get into the redistribution stuff. This also means that I'm not selecting on just successful democratizations here, because I have both democratizations that were attempted and democratizations that were carried through. Usually here I go through a couple case studies of what kind of these democratizations look like. In the interest of time today, I'm going to skip that, but if you guys are really interested, I can go through some of those sort of case studies a little bit later. All right, so let's jump into the results. So I'm going to take that panel data set that has 90 countries and 200 years of data, and those 64 democratization episodes, and I'm just going to kind of look at what happens to dividend yields around those democratizations. So here, I'm showing you the 5-year change in log dividend yields around democratization start, using the 5-year change in dividend yields here, because that's what Tyler Muir did in his 2017 QJE when he was trying to get at changes in risk premia across different historical events. It doesn't really matter. I can use sort of any difference here. It's going to look the same, but kind of baseline results, I do 5 years. You can see here, and so what this is doing is it's looking at the change in dividend yields from T minus 5 to T. So in that event study plot I showed you before, it's going from the beginning of the event study plot up to the kind of rise in dividend yields that we saw at the beginning of the democratization. So this hints at a roughly 20 to 25% rise in dividend yields during democratizations. In a second, I'll kind of distinguish whether we think that's coming from cash flows or discount rates. All right, so for the next 5 or so minutes, I'm going to talk about all of the things that are not driving this result. All right, so first of all, we might just be concerned that just, other stuff, other kind of events are going on alongside democratization. So think like financial crisis, recession, war, coup d'etat, sovereign default, all of these sorts of things could be going on alongside democratizations. I'm going to add an indicator variables that control for all of those in column 2. See here, it doesn't really affect the result all that much. Next, we could be concerned that just common global or regional variation in dividend yields is driving the results. To control for that, I'm adding in year fixed effects, region by year fixed effects, and continent by regime type year fixed effects in columns 3, 4, and 5. You can see here that the point estimates actually grow, if anything here. Last but not least, on column 6, I'm adding in controls for a few different macro variables, so controls for the inflation leading into these democratizations, GDP growth leading into these democratizations, and indices denoting the level of physical violence. Again, here we don't see that there's a tremendous effect. Next, we could just be worried that an increase in macroeconomic risk is driving these results, right? It could be that macroeconomic risk kicks off a democratization, and that also raises dividend yields, and so that's kind of what's going on here. Again, though, that also doesn't seem to be what's going on here. So here, I'm looking at what happens to GDP per capita growth in the 5 years after the democratization begins, right? So now I'm going from T to T plus 5 in that event study plot that I showed you earlier. See that there's just not a whole lot to write home about. Average log GDP per capita growth is pretty much 0 right after the democratizations. There's also not a huge change in aggregate dividend growth as well. This is why I'm going to kind of argue that this is mostly driven by a change in discount rates and not a change in cash flows. That said, I'm not able to sort of track changes in the composition of these aggregate countrywide indices. So it could be that the composition of these indices is changing a bit. That's where a cash flow channel is going to kind of sneak in a little bit when I get to the model. Just as kind of like a baseline, I'm showing you here also the results for financial crises. Here we see it's a very different story. There's large declines in average GDP per capita growth and large declines in dividend growth. So there we saw that the dividend yield rise was the same, but kind of the things that happen after these episodes start are a bit different. Now, risk isn't just about first moments, right? It's also about second moments, third moments, on and up. Here I'm showing you the histogram of realized GDP growth and consumption growth, both inside and outside of democratization episodes. You can see that they're basically the same. There's not much of a difference here. Next, you could be saying, well, Max, this is good and well, but isn't this just driven by a rise in political risk during democratizations? Wouldn't we expect to see the exact same thing in other periods where political risk is presumably high? So to get at this, I'm picking out 3 different episodes which are, kind of maybe come with similar political risk to democratizations, but don't come with the same possibility of a transition to democracy. In particular, I'm looking at garden variety regime changes. So these are regime changes that are not labeled as autocratizations or democratizations. Autocratizations, just the flip side of democratizations, and international political crises, which I'm getting from the international crisis behavior data set. And I'm looking at the 5-year change in log dividend yields going into the start of these events. You can see here that there is an increase in dividend yields in all of these events, but they're one, not statistically different than 0 in sort of all of them. And 2, if I do an F-test and I compare the coefficient on democratization with all of these other events, I see that the rise in dividend yields we see in democratizations is statistically larger than both autocratizations and international political crises. Once we add in some of the more granular fixed effects, it's close for the regime changes, but not quite there. So this gives us some evidence that there seems to be something special going on in democratization, aside from just an increase in, say, generic political risk or transition risk. Now, of course, I can kind of sit here all day and just tell you all sorts of different things that don't seem to be driving this result, but that would take a long time. The sort of ideal thing that we'd like to do is take 2 groups of countries, treat one of them with a higher probability of undergoing a democratization, keep the other one sort of constant, and then look at like a nice direct proxy for the risk premium, something like average excess returns, over a nice long horizon after that treatment, and see if that's different after we kind of increase the probability of democratization. So what I'm going to do now is try to do something that kind of gets at that kind of ideal natural experiment that we'd like to do using some quasi-natural variation, or quasi-experimental variation. So to do this, I'm going to use a change in Catholic Church doctrine in favor of democracy from 1959 to 1963. Now, this is going to constitute a plausibly exogenous shock to the probability that majority Catholic autocracies democratize, as it was, 1, mostly driven by the unexpected election of Pope John XXIII to the papacy, and 2, his unexpected decision to call the Second Vatican Council in 1959, which made the doctrinal shift official in 1963. Now, you guys might be saying, well, okay, how relevant could the Pope's decision be? I was thinking that as a Jewish guy studying Catholicism. But this doctrinal shift is noted as being extremely important in the political science literature. So famed political scientist Sam Huntington lists this doctrinal shift as one of the main reasons that the third wave of democracy occurred, and why it was focused in mostly majority Catholic autocracies. We can also see the relevance of the doctrinal shift in the data. So here I'm showing you an event study of 2 key predictors of future democratizations, comparing majority Catholic autocracies to non-Catholic autocracies. So the first one is anti-regime activity coming from civil society organizations. It's just a fancy way of saying membership in clubs devoted to overthrowing the existing regime. The second is democratic mobilizations and protests. We can see that after the change in Catholic Church doctrines, both of these measures spike substantially in the majority Catholic autocracies relative to the non-Catholic autocracies. And for the membership in clubs devoted to overthrowing the existing regime, we see it spike strongly during the actual years of treatment. So it seems as though this change in Catholic Church doctrine materially changed the political realities on the ground in these majority Catholic autocracies. So what am I going to do? I'm going to estimate just a standard static single difference in differences specification. I'm going to do it on a few different sort of subsamples. First is going to be a symmetric sample window that excludes World War II, so just a symmetric window that goes, just excludes World War II, and then there's a symmetric on the other side. The other one's going to be a symmetric 20-year window around the years of treatment, and I'm going to exclude the years of treatment from 1959 to 1963. I'm going to do this on 2 control groups. One's going to be all countries. It's going to have more observations, but the other one's going to, it's going to be less well-balanced on sort of characteristics. The other one's going to be autocracies only, which is going to be a lot better balanced on characteristics, but have fewer observations. I'm going to include several different political event and macro controls, and I'm going to risk adjust the average excess returns for time-varying global and continental risks. So you can think about this as me removing sort of orthogonal risk factors that have nothing to do with the local political risks that I'm ultimately concerned with measuring here. Now, the identifying assumption underlying all of this is, absent the shift in Catholic Church doctrine, majority Catholic autocracies and non-Catholic autocracies would have trended similarly. So ultimately what this means is that parallel trends really needs to hold here. And reassuringly, it seems to be the case. So here I'm showing you a 5-year moving average of those global and continental risk-adjusted returns for the majority Catholic autocracies compared to the non-Catholic autocracies. We can see prior to the doctrinal shift, there's just not a whole lot to write home about. Then, during the shift in Catholic Church doctrine, we see large negative realized returns for the majority Catholic autocracies relative to the non-Catholic autocracies, which is consistent with an increase in discount rates during that treatment period. Then, after the shift in Catholic Church doctrine, we see high realized average excess returns for the majority Catholic guys relative to the non-Catholic guys, again consistent with an increase in discount rates during that treatment period. Just doing this all the different ways I told you I'd do it, the change in Catholic Church doctrine is associated with a roughly 6 to 11 percentage point increase in average excess returns. All right, so I've got about 10 minutes left. So after pinning down that democratization seems to drive an increase in risk premia, the last thing that I want to do today is kind of provide you guys some evidence that this is driven by a rise in redistribution risk. Now, so the first thing I want to show you is that actual redistribution follows these democratizations, conditional on them being successful. Next, I want to show you that high redistribution risk democratizations see a larger sort of rise in dividend yields. And last, I want to kind of tie all of this together and say, well, is this redistribution actually quantitatively large enough to explain the large increase in dividend yields that we also see in the data? So let's get into all of those. So first thing that I'm looking at here is I'm just doing a simple sort of difference estimator comparing successful democratizations to failed democratizations across 4 sort of measures of explicit redistribution, or what I'm calling explicit redistribution. So I'm looking at the change in government revenue to GDP ratios, tax revenue to GDP ratios, the Gini coefficient, and the labor share of income in the 20 years after a successful democratization compared to a failed democratization. We see that all of these measures are pointed towards more redistribution. And if we accumulate up these effects over the 20 years that I'm looking at, this corresponds to a 4.8 percentage point rise in government revenue GDP ratios, a 4 percentage point rise in tax revenue GDP ratios, a 2.3 percentage point decline in the Gini coefficient, and a 6.7 percentage point rise in the labor share of income. We also see sort of more sort of measures of tacit redistribution spiking during democratizations as well. So here I'm looking during successful and failed, for successful democratizations relative to failed democratizations, across measures that kind of say how much rents can be extracted from the government by maybe the existing elites. So I'm proxying for that by looking at corruption and bribery measures, and how much sort of competition and new entry do we have in these successful during these successful democratizations. I'm proxying this with measures of indices denoting the level of pro-competitive regulation in these countries and the creation or the change in the number of firms. We can see here again that all of these measures are corresponding with more redistribution and not more redistribution. Last but not least, I also want to see if high redistribution risk democratizations see the largest rise in dividend yields. So the way that I'm getting at this is I'm looking at democratizations where the most powerful political group prior to the democratization are the existing elites, which I'm getting this from the Varieties of Democracy database. I'm grouping together here the aristocracy, business elites, and political elites versus sort of other democratizations where, say, the military or some foreign power was the most powerful group prior to the democratization. We see here that almost all of my results are coming from these elite democratizations, and the non-elite democratizations really don't see a particularly large rise in dividend yields. So this gives some evidence that the effect is concentrated in sort of high redistribution risk democratizations relative to lower redistribution risk democratizations. All right, so I've shown you guys that redistribution follows these successful democratizations. The last thing that I want to do today, very quickly, is kind of run through a model that I'm going to take these estimates that I have of redistribution. I'm going to see if we're able to actually match the rise in dividend yields that we see in the data. So this model is going to be based off of Oshimoglu and Robinson 2006, their sort of textbook treatment of game theoretic models of democratic transition. In the model, there's going to be 2 different types of agents. There's going to be a group of wealthy elites, and there's going to be a group of poorer citizens where the elites are going to be outnumbered by the citizens. Endowment's going to be produced by a Lucas tree, which evolves with constant drift and log normal shocks. Like I said, there's going to be a group of wealthy elites, so this endowment is going to be split unequally. The elites are going to get a fraction theta of the endowment. The citizens are going to get 1 minus theta, where I'm going to assume that theta is greater than delta, so that's how the elites get more income here. The elites denoted by superscript are going to be denoted by superscript R for rich, the citizens by superscript P for poor. Markets are going to be incomplete, so the citizens and elites aren't going to trade with each other. The elites are going to be the ones who are going to be my marginal investor here, so they're going to be the only ones participating in financial markets. And there's going to be a few different ways in which redistribution occurs. So first of all, I'm going to allow this theta parameter that denotes inequality to vary with the regime that's in place. So it's going to vary based off of whether we're in an autocracy or a democracy. There's also going to be a single fiscal instrument in this economy, a non-negative tax tau, which is going to be taken in by the government and then distributed somewhat unequally to different citizens. It's still going to be more equally distributed, though, than the actual output coming from the Lucas tree. And altogether, this is going to be the after-tax income for each one of these groups. We're able to see kind of the different forms of redistributions. There's going to be taxes, tau. There's going to be changes in inequality. And I'm also going to allow the sort of unequal distribution of government resources to change with the regime we're in as well. So these are going to be the sort of three of the sort of four sources of redistribution that are coming in this model. I'm also going to kind of, in reduced form, impose a Laffer curve here. So that's what this kind of cost, this quadratic cost is doing here. Basically, it's going to make it so that I have interior solutions for the tax rates that the elites and the citizens would like to choose, conditional on them having political power. All right, so the upshot of all of this is that, in this model, the elites don't like the taxes. They don't get as much as what they get from their market income here. So their preferred tax rate, if they get to choose it, is going to be zero taxes within this model. The citizens, on the other hand, like these taxes, and so their preferred tax rate, again, if they get to choose it, is going to be the revenue maximizing tax rate in this economy, tau p star. Now, taxes here are going to be decided by majority rule voting, where who has the right to vote is going to depend on the political institutions that are in place at each time. Particularly, there's going to be two different types of political institutions, autocracy and democracy. Now, in autocracy, only the elites can vote, and absent some sort of outside force acting on them, they're always going to want to choose to have zero taxes in this economy. In democracy, on the other hand, everyone can vote, and since the citizens outnumber the elites, their preferred tax rate, tau p star, is always going to be put in place. Now, I hinted at some sort of outside force constraining the policies of the elites. That outside force is that the citizens can revolt. Now, if the citizens revolt, they're assumed to be successful, and all of the elites are killed. Now, the elites don't want to die, so what they're going to do in order to try to prevent this is try to make the citizens indifferent between the sort of revolutionary state and the autocracy state. And the way that they're going to do this is that they're going to offer temporary taxes and transfers to the citizens that make them just indifferent between accepting autocracy and engaging in the revolution. But as mu goes down to lower and lower and lower values, sort of temporary taxes and transfers aren't going to be enough to make it so that the citizens don't want to revolt. So what can the elites do? Well, what they'd like to do is just promise future taxes and transfers, right? So they say, hey, we're not just going to give you stuff today, we'll give it to you tomorrow, the day after that, so on and so forth. But the citizens are smart. They understand that there's no way that these promises are credible, right? So if mu goes back up to some sort of high value, the elites are just going to renege on all their promises of future redistribution, so the citizens aren't going to believe it, and they're just going to revolt. So what can the elites do? Well, they can change political institutions. They can offer the citizens democracy, which allows them to take political control and set the tax rate that they prefer, and that's going to allow them to prevent the redistribution. But democracy is costly. It still brings about all that redistribution that I just talked about. And so the prospect, or an increase in the probability that this happens, is still going to have a large effect on asset prices. The sort of important state that you guys have to consider here, so I'm going to calibrate mu to follow a three-state Markov process. The important state here is going to be this middle one, the democratization state, where there's going to be some probability of a transition to democracy, but also some probability that the democratization fails. And this ends up being true in the data. But half of the democratizations that I see do not come with a successful permanent transition to democracy at the end of the day. And it's going to be this uncertainty over success or failure that's going to bump up risk premia here. All right, so once we transition to democracy, the elites are going to lose a lot of consumption. There's going to be redistribution. They don't like that redistribution. The consumption process of the elites is therefore just going to follow the exact same process as the Lucas tree, but it's going to have a disaster term in there when we transition from autocracy to democracy, where the magnitude of the disaster is going to depend on how much taxes rise, how much inequality falls, and how much government spending inequality falls. And I'm also going to allow this redistribution to be uncertain. This I'm going to end up calibrating to the difference in the return effect that I see on deeper democratizations versus sort of shallower democratizations, but I can't kind of get into that today. This is a giant parameter table of what I'm calibrating to. It's basically all the estimates that I showed you from before. The only sort of important thing here is that I'm modeling the dividend claim as the claim to incumbent firms in this economy. So what this means is that once we transition to democracy, some of those incumbent firms are going to be displaced by new entrants. They're going to lose about 23% of their profits, which I'm calibrating to evidence from the Indonesian transition that Ray Fisman provides in his 2001 AER here. So that's going to be the fourth source of redistribution, that incumbents are going to be displaced and lose profits. That's where the cash flow effect is going to come in here. It's also going to make it so that there's no aggregate cash flow effects within this model, which is consistent with the data. All right, so the model, when calibrated to those estimates I showed you, generates the entirety of the change in dividend yields. Most of this is generated by a risk premium effect, though there is an important cash flow effect here. In fact, the single largest contributor to the dividend yield effect is the increase in competition, so that cash flow effect, but it's just that the other channels constitute about 60% of the total result once you add them all up. I don't have time to talk about why autocratizations don't have a non-zero effect. If someone asks me about it in questions, I'll answer it, though. All right, so just to conclude, what I've shown you today is that any financial history over the last 200 years that excludes democratizations is ultimately incomplete. I've shown you that democratizations come with large increases in risk premia, similar in magnitude to what we see during financial crises. Provided some evidence that this is driven by a rise in redistribution risk, and then I've quantified the channels of redistribution that are most important for generating this result. Got tons of paths for future research I'd like to explore with this, but mainly I'd just like to thank you guys for listening. Sorry for going 45 seconds over. I look forward to getting Pietro's comments.